I'd like to begin by speaking a bit about poetry, not visual art, because in some ways your experience with repression begins with that of a very respected Chinese poet, your father. Can you tell us a little bit about how that happened and how you first became aware that your father had been banished, essentially?
The year I was born, 1957, my father was criticized as a rightist. That means, with about 500,000 intellectuals was purged by Communist Party. Even he was being called the revolutionary poet, the poet of the people, and also the poet of the nation. Sometimes they call him. And still he has been sending to re-education labor camps, first at Northeast, then later transferred to Xinjiang, where he spent over maybe 18 years. I spent about 15 years in Xinjiang. And the location now being criticized to have these camps for Uyghur people. So I grew up there. The time when I grew up, he's not a poet anymore. He's forbidden to write. So he has to clean the public toilets for the very low, very poor village. And there was 13 of them. And day after day, he is working on that. He never took one day off because otherwise he couldn't handle the next day. So, but I still know he's a poet. And he did have some poetry books about his own and all. Other fellow poets, international poets. And in my mind, poetry is dangerous. Poetry is poisoning. And poetry is what authoritarian state think it's threatening to their existence. Mm-hmm. So for me, I always think that is a treasure. But of course, we cannot really read poetry anymore. I have to help him to burn all the books all together, and page by page, beautiful collections. And because this is so dangerous to have those poetry.
That's horrific. And it seems as though your father maintained a sense of solidarity with all the people, the most humble people, the people in the villages. It also suggests, in a way, very much the spirit that most of the Chinese people must have felt with the revolution, that, there would be an ennobling of ordinary people. You've written that many of your own projects have poetic elements. Can you talk a little bit about how your father's example and experience have influenced your own art?
I think if anybody have deeply influenced me, is my father. And from him, I learned how we deeply rooted in the reality reflects our true feelings and speak out relentlessly about the truth and about what comes to our aesthetic and moral judgment. This is what I learned from him. And without thinking about the consequence and without putting yourself in consideration, but rather to make yourself be as a part of the human society or humanity. So he has been doing that for his lifetime, and he has showed me the way how poetry and art can be the best tool in defending of humanity.
Hmm. Your father's exile, and with it yours and your family's, was presumably intended not just to remove him, but also to inflict disgrace and shame. And yet he seems to have come through that with a tremendous sense of dignity and composure and acceptance. Your own spirit, I think, is more overtly defiant in many ways. Was that something that you consciously chose as a way of developing your own response to repression?
Well, I think I'm lucky when I was very young to see how badly my father has been treated. So I can see how humanity can change in certain circumstances, and there will be no light to shade on this kind of darkness and inhuman treatment for not just day but for years. And also you also prepared to accept that will be your life. Still under that kind of condition, my father always with a very open heart and positively thinking about life, not thinking about him as a poet or artist, but thinking about how to live an honest life. So that is the most difficult but most valuable education.